But I think we probably have everyone back and we may as well get started. So I'm going to start in a second by sharing my screen. You'll remember this morning you were talking about the conversation guidelines and added some suggestions for conversation guidelines. Since then, we've gone and had a look at them. And there were a few groups that sort of had put in very, very similar things. So apologies if your particular group's exact wording isn't there, but I think we've managed to capture what was meant by all of the groups without repeating them too much. So I will share my screen and do a little recap of the conversation guidelines. So these were the guidelines that I, suggested at the beginning. Is that coming up right for everybody?
Yeah, it didn't to begin with, but we see it now, Kayla.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So conversation guidelines. These are the ones we suggested, and so it looks like from the discussions and the notes from the discussions that everyone thought they were a pretty good starting point and a reasonable starting point, and not something, that there was going to be a problem with. But there were a few other suggestions of things that people thought would help as well to add in. So here's a range of them there. There was a suggestion of be considerate and try to understand other people's views. They may be different to your own. And I expect as we go forward, you will find people with a lot of quite different views to your own. Be patient with other people, support them and take time. We all have different backgrounds and different levels of understanding. And I think it's really important we acknowledge that. And Alan was saying at the beginning, like you've been selected to be part of this assembly because you are all different and come from all sorts of different backgrounds and had different levels of involvement in thinking about some of these issues. The next one there, the point is to hear different views, not persuade everyone to share yours. And while there will be some of that as we move forward, at the moment, let's really think about opening it up and taking the time to really listen to what other people have got to say and why they maybe are saying it. Try to get the balance between being clear and not prattling on, which was what was suggested to us when making sort of more complex or more nuanced points there. That idea of being measured with how you speak, and when you speak your mind, you're allowed to have views, and it's really important we do have views, but considering how you're speaking so that, you're trying not to offend others as well. Try and back up your views with the reasons why. Really important as we start digging into some of this to try and understand why people hold different views. Respect each other's opinions, even if you don't actually agree with them. Have an open mind and approach the discussions, hopefully with an open mind. Acknowledge that we're all bringing different personalities, backgrounds, contexts, politics, attitudes. Be ready to listen and see it as an opportunity to learn. And I think that last part was a really key point there about the opportunity to learn. And keep to the topic and the overarching question. So that's gone through and just collected up things from all of the different groups. Hopefully you can see your group's discussions reflected in those, and hopefully they're all so guidelines for helping frame our conversation that people think will be useful and will be a good way of enabling the assembly to work well together. We will have an opportunity to sort of, reflect back on these, see if there's any more we need to add, any that we feel aren't, working for us as we go through the 6 weekends. So you'll remember that before lunch, you were discussing this idea of sort of the likes and dislikes, okay? Likes and dislikes about how democracy is working in the UK at the moment. What we're going to move on to this afternoon is really starting to think about, well, what would a good democracy look like then? And actually, that doesn't mean that we're thinking that we don't have a good democracy. As you all identified, there's many features of our democracy and the way our democracy is functioning that people do like and people do value. But, you know, so it's not necessarily about trying to change everything to look for what would a good democracy look like. But from the amount of dislikes that we heard as well, hopefully it does, you know, I think all of you are thinking, or the majority of you seem to be thinking, there are things that could be tweaked, and some of you are thinking probably there are things that really could be a lot better, make it much more effective for people. So before we put you back into the breakout groups and give you time to start this conversation about what would a good democracy look like, I just want to share back a kind of summary view of some of the key issues that were reported back this morning and came up in the discussions. And we've put them together in a visual way, tried to use as many of the words people were using as possible, but sometimes there's word limits on the, character limits and text limits on this. So hopefully you'll, even if you don't see your exact words up there, you'll recognize the themes. So I'm just going to share my screen again so I can show you this. I'm still in conversation guidelines. So when you were all talking about what you like about democracy in the UK, a couple of things that came through were pretty clear. And so we've done them here as a word cloud where things were coming through in lots of groups. The text is a little bit bigger. And some of the things that even may have been discussed in different groups, you know, they were sort of only really highlighted by fewer people. They're a bit smaller. Doesn't mean that we've made any judgment on these yet, because that's what you're going to start talking about soon. But right at the center there, that we have a vote, okay? Came up across all of the groups when you were prioritizing what you actually really like. And the fact that all can vote, there was lots of interest in that idea of sort of multiple parties. There are different perspectives. There is levels of choice. And then some of the other things that came up that actually, you know, recognizing that democracy is more than voting. Also that idea that, you know, it's good that there are people whose job is to represent the public and represent their opinions in decision making. The idea down the bottom there about can affect change, that actually, you know, the public can drive things that they want to see happen. Maybe not always as well as we'd want them to, but, you know, that we can. Civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom to protest, all of those things, the right to protest came up as being important to our democracy. And one of the other things that was really highlighted there is that, you know, anyone can stand to be elected and to represent other people and contribute to the democratic culture. So they were some of the things that you all said you liked. Well, collectively said you liked. Doesn't mean you all have to agree. And then when we talk about things that people didn't like, dislikes, as we acknowledged in the feedback earlier, there, you know, in a lot of groups, there was quite a few more of them that came out. Some of the dislikes about democracy in the UK that you highlighted were things like the voting system. And there was some talk about sort of first past the post not being a great system, and various groups talked about different aspects of the voting system that they didn't think worked very well. The lack of accountability, or that feeling that actually politicians aren't necessarily always held to account, or, you know, get away, there's not consequences for people who, and lots of talks about, you know, things like lies or not doing their job very well, but not enough consequences. There was a number of the groups highlighted that idea that Parliament doesn't feel like it's actually representative of what the population of the UK is actually like. And talk there about sort of too much about sort of parties and party politics, and that sometimes that can get in the way of, you know, what people think are the important decisions that need to be made. Another theme that was coming through was the power of money and big money, that there are perceived as being uneven ways of being able to influence decisions, and the influence that some unelected people have, whether it's, you know, whether that's through a lobbying system. It was highlighted in at least one of the groups around sort of House of Lords, and sometimes it was also highlighted about staff and what the expertise is there. I'm not going to read out all of them, but I think you can hopefully see that and get a sense of some of the things that were concerning, maybe not just the discussion that you were initially involved in, but actually were coming up more widely across the Assembly membership. When you go into the breakout rooms, we're going in now just for probably about half-hour conversation to really start thinking about, well, what would a good democracy look like? After you've had a chance to reflect on this and think about, well, what are the likes and dislikes? We'll come back, we'll hear a bit more information, and we'll continue on this theme of looking at sort of what would a good democracy look like throughout the afternoon.
We are ready to open the breakout rooms.
Okay, so we're a bit late going into the breakout rooms. I think we will just have to reassess the times a little, but I think we'll put you in there for about 25 to 30 minutes. We'll give facilitators a heads up, okay? And off you go, enjoy. Okay, so that looks like everyone's made it back from the breakout rooms. Hopefully, starting to dig into some of these questions, thinking about some of the different aspects of the topic, about sort of likes and the breadth of the types of conversations we can have about democracy, where there are positives, where there are concerns, what starts building a good democracy. And thinking, hopefully picked up on some of the things that came out with other groups and other parts of the conversation. So we're now moving more into the sort of some more evidence. I think for this bit, for the next block of the afternoon, you are going to be hearing quite a lot of information. Do try and make sure you've got somewhere that you can take notes, even if it's just taking notes of questions or points or something that seemed, really important to you. Sorry, that is a fire engine going past my house if you're hearing that noise. But do make sure that you've got somewhere to take down notes, whether it's notes of things that sort of stick out as being important and you really want to make sure you remember, or whether it's notes that you go, and I've got some questions about that, I'm going to need to follow that up later. Because as well as all the speakers that you're hearing from this afternoon are going to be around and available to come in once we put you back into the breakout rooms for some discussion, able to come in and add a bit more clarification or, expand on some of the points that they might have made. So first up, really pleased to welcome Albert Weale, who's going to be our first speaker this afternoon. He's Professor of Political Theory and Public Policy in the Department of Political Science at University College London. And he's talking to us today about, well, what is so good about democracy? And I'll hand over to you. You're actually muted, Albert.
Standard problem. Thank you very much, Kayla. As Kayla was saying, I've been asked to talk on the question of what's so good about democracy, which is obviously a huge subject. So I'm going to have to skate over the issues very quickly. Could I have the first slide, please? So just to remind you, I think you've already had a session this morning on what we mean by democracy, but just to pick out 2 or 3 important points. To my way of thinking, the most important thing about democracy is that it's a system of government and opposition, that the decisions of government can be contested by the opposition. And that really means that political power is held by elected representatives, not, for example, by one political party or by military, religious or hereditary leaders. It obviously requires free and fair elections. One of the ways in which one-party systems operate is that they rig elections. They don't make them free and fair. So democracy requires free and fair elections. It also requires political equality. It requires all adults to be able to participate on equal terms, freedom of expression, and no governmental political censorship of the media. Could I have the next slide, please? If you look around the world at countries that can be called democracies, this is a map from a US independent organization called Freedom House, which looks at, tries to measure the status of democracy in different countries. I think the green ones are the democratic countries, the purple ones are the non-democratic countries, and the mustard-coloured ones are democracies, but with some qualifications. I always think this map is a little bit misleading, actually, because a number of the large countries like Canada and the US Greenland sticks out there, are democracies. But as we'll see, most countries in the world are not democracies. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what's so good about democratic government? And there are two possible sorts of answers that you can give to that question. One is that you can value the results of democratic government, or you can value the intrinsic features of democratic government. It's a bit like buying a car. You can buy a car because it gets you effectively from A to B, or you can buy a car because of its intrinsic features, like the fact that its steering is good or it's very comfortable to ride in and so on. So we can look at democracy from these two aspects. Could I have the next slide, please? So in terms of valuing the results, does it get you from A to B? I'm going to look under two headings, economic prosperity on the one hand and population health on the other. So could I have the next slide, please? Now, I'm going to slow down a little because this slide and the next couple of slides are important, but they get a bit crowded. So I'll just talk you through these. So on the left-hand side, we can divide countries into three broad groups. Those that were democracies in 1950 and have remained stable democracies ever since. Those who were not democracies in 1950 but have become democracies since and have been relatively stable. And then thirdly, non-democratic countries or countries that are unstable in some way. So we can divide countries into those three broad groups. And along the top, I've divided the countries into low and middle income countries on the one hand and high income countries on the other. This is the International Monetary Fund definition, which says that you're high income if your income per head is about £9,000 or more. And then that gives you the nice 6 cells into which you can put your different countries. I've just put some specimen countries here, but could we have the next slide, please? Because I've then tried to populate this with as many countries around the world as I could get into these slides. And if you look at that slide, you'll see on the top right that the high income countries are also the stable democracies, the countries that were democracies in 1950 and have remained stable ever since. If you look at the bottom left, you can see that the low to middle income countries are by and large non-democratic or unstable democracies. Now, life is never quite so simple as to divide us into two groups. So if you look at the bottom right, for example, you can see that there are some high income countries that are non-democracies, but by and large, these tend to be oil-rich states or rather special cases like Singapore. What can we conclude from a table like this? Well, the one thing that stands out is that democracy is associated with economic prosperity and non-democracy is associated with lack of prosperity. Now, of course, there's a huge discussion as to whether it's the prosperity that brings about the democracy or the democracy that brings about the prosperity. But there's no doubt that democracy is associated with prosperity. Of course, prosperity is not the only thing in life. What about health? Could I have the next slide, please? And here again, on the left-hand side, I've divided the countries into the same three groups. But at the top, I've made a distinction between high infant mortality countries and low infant mortality countries. Infant mortality is defined as child death within a year of birth. And I've drawn a line at 5 per 1,000 live births, 0.5%, essentially. And there again, you can see a very similar picture to the picture that we saw in the case of prosperity, namely in the top right, those countries which have low infant mortality are the democracies, and those countries down at the bottom left, which are non-democratic or unstable, tend to have high infant mortality. Top left, just to note, notice that the USA has just above 5 per 1,000 live births. It has 6 per 1,000 live births, but that's an interesting exception, which we may want to come back to in discussion. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I've said at the beginning there are two possible answers, types of answers to the question. Value results, I've already talked about. Does it get you from A to B? What about the intrinsic features? So could I have the next slide, please? So here I'm going to look under the intrinsic features at two things, political freedoms on the one hand and equal rights on the other. So could I have the next slide, please? So I've chosen a slide of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. These are East German citizens tearing down the wall, which kept them in East Germany and which was policed very heavily. About 12 years before the Berlin Wall fell, I did visit East Berlin, and I have to say that it was a grey and joyless place. But more importantly, it was a place that was constant surveillance of political attitudes and behaviour of its citizens. So East Germany was not a democracy. And what democracy gives you, by contrast, and what these East German citizens are struggling for and tearing down the wall, are those political freedoms of the right to oppose government and the freedom from government surveillance. Could I have the next slide, please? The second sort of intrinsic feature of democracy that I've called attention to is equal rights. Here's a women's suffrage demonstration in Hyde Park in 1908. The characteristic feature, the distinctive feature of democracy is that everybody has equal rights of participation in political life. In fact, you can tell the story almost of democracy of the spread of voting rights. At one stage in the United Kingdom, only those who were relatively rich had the right to vote and participate in politics. And gradually over the course of a century or so, that right spread out to the full population. So democracy has, I think, this intrinsic and very important feature that it gives equal rights to everyone. Could I have the next slide, please? So I've been talking right in the center here about the values of democracy, whether the results or the intrinsic values. If I understand it correctly, your task is going to be to try and think about how these values play into our thinking about voters, parties, parliament and government. That's a very demanding task, but at the present time, I can't think of one that's more important. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Albert. We are going to have a 10-minute break now. That opportunity to sort of have a bit of a stretch, collect, reflect on some of the things that Albert has said. I would encourage you, if you don't have something with you to take notes, to use that time to grab something to take some notes as well, because when we come back, we're going to be hearing a series of more presentations before that are there to really sort of test out, well, what are some of the features? We've talked about why, what are the values, what is sort of in principle side of democracy, but what are some of the features that really are important to making a democracy work? So, and just a reminder that, you will have the opportunity to call all of the speakers into your breakout rooms if there are questions you want to be asking them once we go later. So let's go on break, and feel free to turn your cameras off, or you can just walk away and leave us looking at your seat. That's fine. And we will restart at 3:13. 3:13. So, as I said before the break, for the rest of the afternoon, we're going to be thinking about, well, what are sort of the features that we might look for in a democracy or in a good democracy? And to give us a bit of a starting point for that, I'm going to hand over to Alan, who's going to sort of give us a bit of a framework to start thinking before we hear from our next three speakers this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kayla. Yeah, so just before the break there we had a really nice overview from Albert about some of the kind of fundamentals about why we might value democracy. And now we're going to get further into the question that you're exploring this afternoon around what should a good democracy actually look like? What are the features of a good democracy? And obviously your ideas here are what matter, but just to give you a few thoughts as to what things you might think about, we're going to put up a few ideas now. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen there now. So what we've got here, if I can get my screen to advance, there we go. We've got 11 suggestions of what might be features of a good democracy. And these are very much things for you to discuss. You might disagree, you might want to word them a bit differently, you might want to add a few things, but we think these are probably some of the fundamental features that most people would think about when they're thinking about a good democracy. And indeed, quite a lot of these were touched upon in the conversations that you had before lunch and that we heard reported on before lunch. So I'm just going to very quickly run through them, and then we'll have 3 speakers who'll talk a little bit more about them. So the first one there, those in power can be voted out if they do a poor job. So that definitely came up in your discussions this morning. The second one, I'm going to go down the columns here, okay? So the second one, letter B, decision making is transparent, and it's possible to find accurate information. So those ideas of transparency and accurate information both came up actually in your discussions this morning, but slightly separately. So there may be several different things in that element that need to be thought about. Then C at the bottom, those in power are able to deliver on their manifesto pledges. So again, there may be several elements there. The idea of delivery is related to that idea that Albert was talking about, that you want a democracy to get you from A to B. You want a democracy to deliver results. But also the idea of manifesto pledges there is the idea that you want the system to be delivering on what people have said they will deliver at the election. Then if we go back up to the top, we've got D, issues are given serious consideration before decisions are made. And I think, again, that idea that decisions should be kind of thought through is something that came up in your conversations. E, below that, is people have the same influence on decision making, whatever their background. And I think actually that was the very first point that came out of the discussions this morning when they were presented back, at least from group 1. F, people take part actively. So I'm not sure actually that did come up in what was presented back from the groups this morning. So it's the idea not just that people have the right to take part, but actually that people do take part, and people are active as part of democracy, and we're not just leaving it to others. Then we go back up to the top to G, people in public life are honest and trustworthy. That certainly came up this morning. H, below that, is people's right to express their views is protected. So again, that freedom of speech was something that came from quite a few groups this morning. I, at the bottom, who holds power is decided by free and fair elections. And then we go back up to the top again, and we've got J, people are willing to listen to other points of view and to respect election results, even when they lose, which again, I think came up this morning. And then finally, K, all people are treated equally. And then there's a blank box at the bottom. So as I said, there are probably other things that matter as well, and you might want to think about adding them. So those are the 11 elements that we thought it would be worth kind of bringing up and bringing to your attention. Of course, we could have mentioned others, but these are 11 that are important. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to have 3 speakers who are going to talk a bit more about these and give some ideas on why some of these things might matter, but also ways in which some of these might conflict with each other or be difficult to introduce. So Kayla's just going to introduce three speakers in a moment, but as Caleb will say, we've got Hannah first, who will talk about the 4 elements that are colored in yellow there. And then we're going to have Gráinne, who will talk about those 4 elements there. And then we have Anand finally, who will be talking about these 5 elements. So I shall stop sharing my screen and hand over to Kayla so that she can introduce the 3 speakers.
Okay, so I don't have much more to say other than I hope you're going to enjoy these speakers. After each of the speakers, we'll just have a moment of some pause for reflection, taking down any notes, thinking about any questions there as well. So the first speaker I'm really pleased to introduce to you all is Hannah White, and Hannah's Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. That's really kind of a think tank that aims to make government more effective. So I think I'll just hand it straight over to Hannah.
Great, thanks very much, Kayla, and I'm really excited to be with you all today. It's really great to be part of this process you're all part of. So I'm going to kick off. My first statement, just to keep you all on your toes, is actually statement C that you had previously on the slide that Alan showed you. Those in power are able to deliver on their manifesto pledges. Now, the first thing I think to say is that actually many voters, and maybe many of you, may be very skeptical about politicians and political parties and whether they actually do deliver for people like you. But the basic principle, I think, about a democracy is that it needs, the governments need to be able to get things done. If governments can't deliver, then they're definitely not doing a good job for the people. And the reason that manifestos are important is because voters can't personally know all the different people they're being asked to choose between when they go out to vote. So they have to judge on the basis of what people say they will do. And the democratic system needs to then be able to allow those politicians, once they're elected, to do what they said they would do in their manifesto. So they need to be able to pass laws, they need to be able to spend money, they need to be able to appoint people and set up processes, they need to be able to make treaties, and they need to be able to do that in a timely way. And then voters, once they've seen whether those politicians deliver what they said they would deliver, at the next election can decide whether they want to vote for them again. Now, there are some caveats to that. If a government has a very narrow majority, or indeed doesn't have a majority at all, as we had in this country during the coalition when we had the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, actually, then politicians don't get to deliver exactly what they said they would do in their manifesto, and they may have to negotiate a bit more. And the other point to make, I think, is that just because you have something in your manifesto doesn't mean you don't then have to talk about it, to hear alternative voices and alternative views, and to allow your proposals to be scrutinized before you go ahead and deliver them. So that's the first one, that's C, and those are reasons why you might think that those things are important in democracy. The second statement, which is D on the list, is that issues are given serious consideration before decisions are made. And I touched on this just now. Politicians who are elected often have very strong views on certain issues. And once you're elected into government, you may say, well, the electorate have supported me. I expressed these views, and now I have the right to do these things because I was voted in. But the point in a democracy is that there are lots of people who have been elected to parliament. They may not all be in government, but they all have an electoral mandate. So it's really important for different sides of an issue to be heard and to be discussed, and for all those different voices to be heard before a decision is taken, even if in the end the majority view and the view of those politicians prevails. And I think it's especially important because manifesto promises are often just that. They're fairly high level, they can be just slogans. So you need to work up the detail, and then that detail needs to be seriously considered before a decision is implemented. The trouble with this is that politicians and the public can sometimes feel that all the consultation and the discussion and the scrutiny can delay the delivery of manifesto promises. And so that can be a frustration for people under this point. The third statement I want to talk about is A, going back to A in your bingo chart. And that's that these people who are in power can be voted out if they do a poor job. And I think this is just really important, and I understand you've talked about it already today, that voters need regular opportunities to decide if people who are in power are doing a good job and whether they should be allowed to continue. And the thing about elections is they really give politicians an incentive to achieve results. So if they know that they could be voted out, they must think about the promises that they made to the electorate and how they respond in a crisis, as we've just seen with coronavirus, for example, and they have a real deadline to achieve results by. So they can't just take their time and twiddle their thumbs. They've got to get out there and do what they said they would do. And that's the incentive behind having regular elections. But the trouble is, the counter side to this is that if you can be voted out, if you do a poor job, if you have two elections too frequently and you have changes of government, then it can mean that you have lots of policy changes. You have one side in power, they do one thing, another side in power, they come back and they reverse that and do something else. So that can mean that you don't have a great deal of policy stability. The final one I want to talk to you about is about transparency and finding accurate information. So decision-making should be transparent and it's possible to find accurate information. So this is important because voters, all of you, all of us, need to know what decisions have been made and how those are going to affect their lives. And those decisions might be happening in Parliament. Everyone's not paying attention to what's happening in Parliament all of the time, but it needs to be clear what politicians have decided and how they've gone about that. And that's important because voters need to be able to judge when they next go to the polls whether politicians have done a good job and whether they want them to come back. And I think there's evidence that politicians will make better decisions and do things better if they're aware that the decisions they're making will be scrutinized by people, that people are aware of what decisions they've made and the evidence they relied on to make those decisions. So politicians are more inclined to do a better job if there is transparency around what they're doing. But on this other side of this, of course, the trouble with some of this, people would say, is that all this transparency means that it can slow down decision making, and it means it takes time, it involves people, and it involves cost to make sure that everything's up there on the internet or announced in a way that everybody is aware of what's going on. So those are my four things, my four bids to you about things that you might think are important features of democracy.
Thank you, Hannah. So we're going to have just 1 minute of sort of quiet time, let people just think, reflect on some of that before we hear from our next speaker. Okay, so the next speaker that we're going to be hearing from is Gráinne Walsh. Gráinne is the director of Stratagem. It's a consultancy firm based in Northern Ireland. It's really all about sort of aiming to connect companies and organizations with politics. So Gráinne's got a couple of things she's going to share with us as well.
Thank you very much, Kayla, and I'm delighted to join you this afternoon as you begin your deliberations on how should the UK's democracy work. And what a really interesting question at a really interesting time. And I say that from the perspective of somebody who advises organisations, be they companies, charities, community groups, advise them on how to understand and inform public policy and political parties, as well as being somebody who has over the last number of years been involved with many deliberative processes and conversations about deliberative democracy. I was lucky enough to facilitate at a number of citizens' assemblies and forums. So I suppose I see democracy from many different angles. And I have a particular interest in what's happening in the innovations that are taking place across the UK, be it in communities, be it at local government level, but also be it in Parliament, and what that means for the future of democracy. So some of the topics that I was challenged with thinking about have been covered really well already. So I'm only going to maybe point out or pose a couple of questions that you might want to think about when you're thinking about, let's start with that those in power are able to deliver their manifesto pledges. And we know that parties devote a lot of time and energy in developing manifesto pledges. And I know that organisations and people spend a lot of time thinking and talking to political parties about what they feel should be in manifestos and what should emerge within programme for governments, legislative agendas of governments. But what I would say to you, I think the question that you need to ask yourselves is, what is the role of a manifesto? Is it a pledge? Is it a promise written in stone, as we saw with Ed Miliband a number of years ago? Or is it an aspirational document that provides you with an insight to the values, the perspectives, and the aspirations of political parties? Now, in Westminster, with its tradition of a single party government, which is really a product of the first past the post system, there seems to be a prevailing view that actually manifestos are pledges and that people should be held to account for when they don't deliver. However, in other democracies where you have more proportional electoral systems, actually manifestos are seen maybe as a starter for 10 in negotiations as parties agree to form coalition governments. And there's an element of compromise and conversation actually about what ultimately reflects the settled view of the majority of people rather than the view of the small number of people who voted for a certain political party. So if we go on then to this issue of a serious consideration, and Hannah really helpfully outlined some of the challenges that people may have or concerns they may have about what constitutes serious consideration. Is it that it takes too much time? Is it too expensive? However, the opposite often happens, that if we don't give decisions serious consideration, projects, programs, everything from the Millennium Dome through to HS2 and other large projects end up taking more time and costing more money than initially envisaged. And also there's the issue of unintended consequences of bad policy, or not necessarily even bad policy, but where we just haven't thought through the long-term implications of political decisions. And so what's really interesting at the moment is the movement, and you may wish to look at the conversation around the Future Generations Bill that is currently in front of Parliament, that says actually politicians and government should have a mind to the impact of policy decisions on future generations. So it's not just the impact of decisions made now, but it's what impact can we foresee them happening on people in the future. So that's really important, that issue of serious consideration. So moving on to the idea, the proposition that people should have the same influence on decision making, whatever their background. Now, for those of you who may not see themselves or people like you sitting around the cabinet table, you will have an interest in this topic because you may wish to see people like yourself around the cabinet table. And there's also some people, and you may wish to think about this, who if they see themselves and others like them around the cabinet table, they may not have wish to give up that power or their place around the table. But when you are having this conversation, you need to think of the barriers, whether they are social, whether they're educational, institutional, political, or otherwise, that stops people from having the same or some appropriate amount of influence on decisions that impact them. And so let's think about what are the processes, innovations, forums that we could be looking at as a democracy to improve people's access to this or impact on decision making, and what role in the future do politicians have in including people in decision making? So that could be everything from mandating more citizens' assemblies. It could be about enabling people to be involved in participatory budgeting. It also could be about including people or training people in the art of responding to consultations. And also it's important and key to all of this will be the education we receive in school about the role of citizens, the role of people in democracy. And so that's something that you may wish to consider in your deliberations about that particular topic. And finally, that people take part actively. And this is a really interesting idea, and it's something that we see increasingly reflected in the aspirations, not just of minority groups, but of organisations, community groups, all up and down the country, right across the United Kingdom, as the ideas of, as the mantra, the idea of nothing. Now, of course, I've entirely forgotten the mantra, which was the main one, nothing about me without me. And so what's that about? It started with patient empowerment and co-design of services. And it now has evolved to more broader conversations about service delivery across government. So it is important that people actively take part in democracy and the development of public policy, because we know that people report that they are happier, they experience well-being when they have more control of their lives, and they're more likely to support policies and decisions when they make a contribution to those decisions. And so they're just a few of the ideas that I would like you to think about, or the questions I would like you to think about when you come to your deliberations later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gráinne. And just to say again, we're going to have that 1 minute of just quiet and reflection before we move on. Okay, so I'm now really pleased to be able to introduce the last of our speakers this afternoon. We have Anand Menon, who's a Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. He's also Director of UK in a Changing Europe, which looks at research into the relationship between the UK and the European Union. And he's going to share a few sort of ideas and perspectives with us now.
Thanks very much, and hi everyone. I get that you're having to take in an awful lot today, so I'm going to try and keep my remarks short and simple, but with a warning, which is I'm going to provide you with a lot of questions, but I don't think I'm actually going to give you much in the way of answers to them. But it does seem to me that if we split the idea of democracy up into its component bits, it's a really useful way to help us decide what we'd like our democracy to look like. And I've been asked to talk about 5 statements, and they are that everyone is treated equally, that people's rights to express their views are protected, that those who hold power, who holds power is decided by free and fair elections, that people are willing to listen to and respect other points of view and to respect election results even when they lose, and finally, people in public life are honest and trustworthy. And to be honest, I think I've got the easiest job out of the 3 speakers, and the one that's most directly connected to the heart of the debate about what democracy is and what it should be. 3 of the statements highlighted on your screen are about the treatment of people. the idea that people should be treated equally, the idea that people's rights and freedom of speech should be protected, and finally that this equality of people is reflected in elections where everyone gets an equal say. Now, just to show off and to drop in a bit of Greek, these are all therefore issues concerned with what the Greeks call the demos, how the people is defined and defended in a democracy. And the other two statements relate directly not to people but to power. The idea that power should be wielded in an honest way and with integrity, and that those wielding it are willing to concede that power if the people say they should. And the Greek word for power is kratos. So there you have it, demos and kratos, the two elements of the word democracy, people and power. So in essence, I've been asked to talk about what democracy is. And in the time that's left, after showing off my knowledge of Greek, I'm going to try and talk through each of these statements. And as I go over each, I'm going to try and illustrate the fact that these principles, even though they appear self-evident, are probably not as self-evident nor as neat or simple as they might at first appear. So take the first idea, the idea that everyone should be treated equally. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty obvious, but think about that word, everyone. Is a 16-year-old who's still at school part of everyone? Interestingly enough, in Scotland and Wales, for their politics, the answer is yes. In England, it's no. In the 2014 Scottish referendum, the answer was yes. In the 2016 European referendum, the answer was no. What is the correct way to define who the people are? Equally, if you have someone who's in prison for a serious crime, do they count as part of this demos? UK law says no, but in some countries, the answer is yes. And finally, last but not least, there's money. Does a billionaire who donates to a political party or can afford to pay to have dinner with a minister in effect have the same democratic power as a working class kid from a council estate who really has no idea which party is which? Can we talk about democratic equality without talking about money? And what does democratic equality mean in a world of economic inequality? Second up is the claim that we should all have the right to speak our mind. A recent poll showed that 50% of people in the UK think that this right is under threat. But what right should we have to speak our mind? So imagine someone shouting from a street corner that people with a certain skin colour shouldn't be treated equally. Do they have the right to say that? Is their right to say it more important than the right to equality of those to whom the speaker would deny it? Well, what if our speaker is broadcasting their view on Facebook or on the telly or at a political rally? Should they still have the right to speak their mind? And finally, of course, what if it's a politician saying it? Saying, for instance, some people should be denied a vote because of their skin colour or their sexual orientation or the football team they support. I'm a big fan of denying the vote to supporters of certain football teams, but we'll leave that for now. The serious question here is whether there are views that we as citizens should be protected against, even if to do so we have to curtail the right to free speech. The third statement is the idea that elections are free and fair. And on the surface, this seems quite central to democracy. But what is a fair election? Barack Obama once said that there's no such thing as a vote that doesn't matter. But is that really true? In the 2015 election, every vote for UKIP was about 100 times less powerful than one for the Tories. The Tories got 11.3 million votes and over 300 seats. UKIP got 3.9 million votes and 1 seat. To put it another way, it took UKIP about 112 times the number of votes to get a seat. Or think about individual constituencies. If you live in a safe seat where everyone knows who's going to win, does your vote count as much as if you lived in a marginal seat where no one knows who's going to win? And is all of this fair? Do some votes actually count for more than others? And what, if anything, can we do about it? Of course, if you go back to 2016, everyone's vote did have equal weight and Nigel Farage won. But even there were arguments about fairness, about the quality of the campaign, about whether lies were used, about whether referendums are a good way of making decisions, about whether ultimately a popular referendum or the say of Parliament should take precedence. Which brings me to the next statement. People should be willing to listen and respect the other points of view and respect election results even when they lose. But what does this mean in practice? How does it sit with the idea that people are able to speak their mind and say exactly what they think? Surely part of respect the results of what we political scientists call losers' consent for the outcome of votes involves deciding we're going to make sure we win next time. And more practically, how do you stop a load of Remainers banging on about Brexit after losing the referendum? And is losers' consent harder to give for a one-off vote with long-term consequences than in an election when you know you're not going to get another vote in 4 or 5 years' time? Now, it might be that perhaps all of these contradictions can be sorted out if we could trust the folk in charge. If, in other words, the people in public life were seen as being honest and trustworthy. Do we think politicians are more untrustworthy than ordinary people? Does the fact they're interested in politics itself speak to aspects of their character we may not like? Personally, I don't think that's the case, but it's a debate that's as old as time. So let me finish where I started, with the Greeks. The famous Greek political philosopher Plato said that politicians were uniquely unsuited to being in charge. Why? Because they spend their time trying to win power. And so honesty and trustworthiness are almost by definition a lesser priority for them. But Plato's solution was that the philosopher should be in charge. So my final word to you would be careful what you wish for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anand. And as you said, lots of food for thought in there. Now, we've had 4 different speakers, all sort of give you some bits more information and things to consider. And as Anand had said, they're definitely putting a lot of questions out there, a lot of questions for you to start thinking about. And I guess what I want to remind you is that we're at the very beginning of this process. Okay, we're at the very beginning of this process. We're going to be meeting for, I was about to say 16 weekends, 6 weekends. We're going to be meeting for 6 weekends, and over that time, building up our knowledge and understanding. But really importantly this afternoon, it's a chance to start exploring and thinking about, well, what are some of these questions and principles, these features of what should be a democracy that actually seem to be feeling most important right now. Just to say, this is not about making final decisions this afternoon. It's not even about, it's about starting to explore that conversation. So do go with your sort of feelings and things that seem important to you. And remember, all 4 of the speakers are sticking around. So, if there's things you want to hear a bit more, or you do have some questions, or there's things that you actually want to explore with them a little bit more, you can invite them into your breakout rooms, and, they'll join the discussion with you. And on that basis, I think we're going to open up the breakout rooms. And really what you're focusing on here is, what should we be looking for in our democracy? What are the features that really should be the most important and underpin a good democracy? Okay, that looks to me like everyone's made it back. We left you right in there via, I know there was a lot of conversation going on, lots of really interesting challenge that was there for you. So I know it might feel that we haven't really sort of got to the end of these conversations, but that's what we're going to be picking up again on tomorrow. So you'll be able to continue on the conversations you were having and developing the ideas. Now, I know groups were identifying someone to do some feedback in the morning. We'll, it really is just about sort of the couple of things that seemed at first start most important to your group, and, the reasons why. So we are going to finish up now. Really the main thing I have to say again is thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for taking part. I'm not going to open up for other people to say thank yous or anything, but I'm sure Alan and the rest of the team and the speakers and everyone's all really enjoyed being here with you. So we will start again tomorrow morning. We'll start again at 10. You will be sent the link for that so you know how to get into the meeting. And I'm really looking forward to hearing back from some of you about the things you're focusing on this afternoon.